All right. Thank you all for joining. Today is May 2nd. We are very pleased to have William Lamb. And William, I hope I got your title right. Senior Staff Solution Architect. Has that changed with the Broadcom stuff?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked up the the titling, but that sounds about right.
Okay. Yeah. Um, it's one of these things like, changes happen daily for us, but everyone knows you, William. I've known of you for a long time. I won't name what your blog used to be, but everyone knew it. But it's very easy to find williamlamb.com. Today, we're going to cover the VCF deployment methods for labs, whether it's a customer lab, your home lab, or whatever. Today, the holodeck or the PowerShell script, there's uh, some newer stuff that you might cover, William, that may be helpful for customers going forward. Um, the next thing is I just want to show, I'll have all these links and others at the end of this, presented out, whatever. I'll put it in the YouTube link as well, description. So right off the bat, we'll get out of here. One of the many things, as we talked about, William, is starting off, was the holodeck was kind of new to me. Um, I had to kind of research into it, and when all these announcements were coming out about VCF and everything, um, we had two different options initially. I decided to go the PowerShell path because it seemed a little easier to me. Um, but can you kind of describe? Let's start with the holodeck. Can you kind of go into how that came about and what all entails for it?
Yeah, sure. No, first off, thank you for having me. I think this month or maybe it was last month that I did another TAM day, so I'm really happy to be coming back. Yeah, the Holodeck is actually a really fantastic resource, and you'll see going forward, there's a lot of momentum behind it. In fact, I had just learned about Holodeck probably late last year, and it's been an evolution of something called VLC, the VMware Lab Constructor. And I think its original genesis, don't quote me on this, was to really help our partners and working with some of our hardware vendors, provide a lab environment for customers to kind of do POC. And it eventually evolved because it was so popular. And I'll talk about some of the mechanics of it, right? That more and more folks wanted to use it beyond just POC for lab purposes, certainly even for internal development. And as the versions of VCF, especially as we reach the 4x50, that's when I kind of heard about it and then kind of got wrapped into this project called Holodeck. And I'll talk about sort of what's inside of it. But going forward, there's something called VCF Experience. And I think there was even like a Tech Tuesday or a Win Wednesday that kind of deep dive into, helping customers understand what are the use cases they're trying to accomplish and how might they quickly spin up a full end-to-end VCF deployment, right? Not just sort of the foundational pieces, but even components like ARIA, and even some of the Tanzu components, which you typically don't see in some of the automated solutions. And just make it easy for you to have something that's fully isolated and ready for testing purposes. And in fact, we've even heard from some customers that have been leveraging Holodeck for their own internal development and testing purposes, right? So there's a lot of interesting use cases. And I think that's the piece that I would kind of start out is sort of where are the individuals, whether it's our TAM community or even our customers or partners, like what are they trying to accomplish? And ultimately, there are different ways of satisfying those requirements, but certainly from a VCF division standpoint, we do have this VCF experience program that allows us to kind of work with our customers, understand what use cases allow them to deploy this using hardware that they've provisioned. And I'll talk about some of the requirements in a second and sort of what outcomes it can achieve to things that you might want to run in your own home lab environment just for your own experiences and just kind of going through some of the workflows to maybe even writing some automation and script. So Holodeck basically requires a single physical ESXi host. That's sort of its baseline requirements. And so if you've got an existing vSphere environment, I know that many of the folks in the TAM community have a home lab or access to a lab that's already been provisioned, then Holodeck may not necessarily be the solution that you're looking for. And but it does have a minimum bar to get started, which is quite nice. Now we are deploying the full VCF stack, and you may see versions like 2.0, 3.0. These are just internal versions to Holodeck itself. which ultimately reflects the version of VCF. And so I think the latest version that's out there on TechZone is supporting our VCF 5.0 release, I believe. And I think we're getting close, or if not already, a version that supports the latest 5.1 release of Cloud Foundation. And all you need is just standalone ESXi. And so the nice thing about Holodeck is, like I mentioned earlier, it provides an end-to-end deployment stack. And I'll talk a little bit about the workflow and how you get going. But all you need is basically a single host. There is some amount of resources required. As you can imagine, our stack does require some amount of resources. And so there is a document out there that talks about the minimum amount of storage as well as compute. So I think it's north of 350, 380 gigs of memory. And that allows you to deploy one Holodeck, basically end-to-end full VCF stack. So that's the management domain as well as a workload domain. And then if you want to have multiple instances of Holodeck or the VCF instances, then obviously you need a little bit more resources. And one of the really neat thing about Holodeck compared to other solutions that I've seen is that I'm sure many of you are familiar with like hands-on labs, right? Every time you deploy a lab, it's sort of this little bubble. And we use different technologies to provide sort of network isolation so that we're able to basically stamp out this exact environment for repeatability and also for scalability, right? So we leverage our vCloud Director product offering to be able to deploy these labs very, very quickly. And I would describe Holodeck in that similar fashion. What comes with Holodeck is a virtual router. And it's actually very similar to the vPod router that you might have seen or familiar with hands-on lab. And that actually provides all that advanced networking. So you don't need any special networking on the physical front. You don't need VLANs. And that's actually one of the really neat things about this solution that I really like, because typically networking becomes the challenge, right? Depending on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to set up things like BGP, advanced networking with NSX, that's where things start to get challenging. And so with Holodeck, all you need is just one physical host, install ESXi on there minimally, basic port group networking, and then really you download the Holodeck solution, which encompasses this router that gets deployed, and that becomes your virtual networking, right? And that gives you basically this little bubble. And so you can actually deploy multiple instances of Holodeck, right? And this router becomes sort of your input into the infrastructure. So from a networking standpoint, it's actually the most simplistic, right? You actually don't have any requirement because everything that's needed to do all these different advanced workflows, whether it's NSX, setting up BGP, DR, all of that is kind of bubble-tized or in that Holodeck environment. And then to actually get started and make this simple, the team has built, and this came out of the original tech marketing team for VMware Cloud Foundation, is that there are some PowerShell scripts that requires you to provide a Windows evaluation image. So I think it's like a Windows 2019 image, I believe. So you can freely download that, right? So that's really the only prerequisite is you download that. You do need to have a Windows environment running. So you can typically do this like on Fusion, or if you have Workstation running, or just even your laptop. But the reason for that is that through these series of PowerShell scripts, it's going to automatically provision what they call a Holodeck console. And this is very similar to hands-on lab. When you log into that environment, you get an RDP session, you get to a Windows desktop, you've got Active Directory, you've got DNS configuration, you've got all the infrastructure services that's needed to actually go and deploy our infrastructure, including VCF. So all of that is automatically built for you. So all you really need to do is download the PowerShell scripts, download several, binaries. We use things, there's things like PuTTY, Chrome browser, PowerCLI, right? Cloud Builder. So you pull all those dependencies out and you go build that. So this is kind of a net new workflow for most who's not familiar with it, right? Because you do have to do something. And the reason for that is that we, VMware, cannot distribute a Windows OVA, right? In an ideal world, we provide you with an appliance that has all of that, and you just go import these two appliances and you're off to the races, right? So that's really the reason that we can't do that. So you kind of have to go through that step. And so if you run through it for the first time, it might feel a little bit complicated, but it's actually really well documented on our TechZone site. And so you download your Windows image, you build that ISO image. So it actually produces an ISO, and it's actually self-installing. So then you go back to your ESXi host, you import that ISO into your ESXi host, you create the VM, you power it on, it automatically builds out that console VM for you. And that takes about an hour or so, depending on how fast your hardware is. And then at the end of that, you've got your router that provides your networking. You've got that jump host or bastion host or console VM, that's a Windows VM, that you can basically RDP to from any system, right? So Linux, Mac, Windows. And then once you're inside of that environment, you've got Active Directory, DNS, everything that's set up for you including things like networking. And then from there, you're actually going through and running a couple of PowerShell script that basically leverages Cloud Builder, right? So just like we would deploy on a physical hardware, but it's wrapped in a bunch of PowerShell automation using things like VLC to then go and deploy that full management domain for you. And then that's kind of where Holodeck stops from a default experience point of view, right? So if you just wanted to kind of look at what's in the management domain, maybe you're looking to explore the VCF APIs. And again, I go back to kind of use cases, right? Holodeck is great to kind of get you to that management domain. Now, if you want to go further than that and you say, hey, I want to explore some of the ARIA components, maybe I want to look at what a workload domain looks like. If I want to look at what host expansion looks like, if I want to understand how does commissioning, if I want to go through an upgrade workflow, you can do all of that through the management domain. You can also spin up a workload domain. And one thing I didn't cover is that the way that Holodeck handles the provisioning of the ESXi host that powers both the management and workload domain is using nested ESXi. So Holodeck uses nested ESXi as a mechanism, right? So it uses one physical host, and then it goes ahead and deploys all the infrastructure. And then depending on your workflow, whether it's management domain, additional workload domains, it will automatically provision those nested ESXi VMs for you, install ESX for you, and then goes and populates the JSON or XLS file and goes and deploys those workload domains for you. So you're skipping a lot of the steps that you would typically see in a real day zero deployment. So if your goal is to quickly get VCF stood up for your customer and go and experience VCF, go experience patching, upgrade, playing with ARIA, playing with Tanzu, there's a number of sort of add-on capabilities that Holodeck documents. And so you can spin up a workload domain, and then there's further automation that shows you how to deploy the ARIA full stack, right? So then you can deploy VIDM, operations, ARIA automation, and then on top of that, if you want to deploy Tanzu. So it really is the most comprehensive solution from day zero VCF standup all the way to a lot of the day two operation and even some of the consumption standpoint, right? And so if you're interested in like, how do you interact with ARIA, there's a lot of those things that's kind of built in and documented. Again, this all leverages nested ESXi. I know that's a lot of information for Holodeck, so I'll just pause there for a second, see if there's any questions or comments. If not, then I can kind of walk through some other options that's also available for kind of deploying VCF in some type of environment.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please just unmute yourself or type in the chat and ask it. Don't be afraid to. We want interaction. As you see on the screen, that's everything William Lamb has just talked about is here, right? And there is a video that I also posted a link that kind of walks through that process at a high level. So
is that document going to be updated once we hit day 2 because it shows it log into Customer Connect?
Yeah, there's some things that are changing. Obviously, the downloads are going to migrate to Broadcom software portal. So obviously there's a lot that's going on these last couple of weeks, and I know things have been kind of up and down connectivity wise. I don't know for Holodeck specifically because I think today when you request it, I believe we provide you a download link. I thought the download link was coming from like a OneDrive. I would have to check with Teresa where this is ultimately going to go, but the documentation is all public. Tech Zone, I believe, is still staying to a certain degree. I forget the latest on it because there was some back and forth on whether or not Tech Zone would go through a migration. But yeah, content will be there. Documentation is also embedded in the download. So once you kind of get that zip file in Holodeck, all of that documentation is included, or you can reference to the online portal.
I think you are correct. When you go through the Holodeck registration, wherever it is on here, it takes you to like a OneDrive link to download.
That's right. Yeah. Once you fill it out, you answer it, then you'll get the link and then you download that. And I think we also include a copy of the documentation, but I can check with Teresa if and where this is going to go longer term, because I know, some of that kind of still in transition.
Are we going to continue to expand the documentation for the deployment, because it stops with the VRA? So there's not really information for doing the ARIA operations or the ARIA login site pieces.
Yeah, I personally found this a little bit confusing too. I think there was like another part of the Holodeck documentation. I forget what the term that they're using, but it's sort of like all these additional things that you can follow And it does include a lot of the ARIA components there as well. And then there are workflows that go through that. Once you kind of set up the initial VCF stack, from their perspective, it's really just getting that up and running. After that, it is the product as is, right? And so the way that you would go deploy ARIA would be either to go through SCDC Manager, right? And then it does all that integration, automatically sets up log forwarding, sets up all that connectivity, or you can deploy it outside, right, using the ARIA lifecycle management suite. And so after that, it's really just the product. And so I think some of the feedback from the team was sort of like, you can just follow the standard VCF documentation, because from there, there's nothing special about Holodeck anymore, right? It is your core VCF stack. And so there is some complementary content in there to like add a workload domain. How do you expand a workload domain? But after that, it is VCF as is, right? And so there's nothing special in there. And I think some folks, and there is even a Google space for Holodecks for folks that are interested, just search that up on the Google Spaces. And there have been a lot of contributors, including myself, that have additional automation that we've shared, or maybe some tips and tricks. And so from a documentation standpoint, I would just reference you to the standard VCF documentation, because it doesn't really change there. Now, obviously, there are other things and automation that you can use to further accelerate, deploying like Tanzu. And I think some folks have written something, or you can even look at some of the PowerShell code that I've written that just simply uses the APIs and stands up that Tanzu layer for you.
Well, one of the other questions I have is, I actually went in and SSH'd in and grabbed the host file so that I had all the IP addresses for the FQDNs for everything, so I could set up an actual DNS properly for everything. Was that ever documented anywhere where all the FQDNs, or is it?
I'm not sure, because this, I'm not 100% sure on that. Yeah, I mean, it's all there. It's all there if you log into the Cloud Builder appliance. There's some MariaDB entries and all that. So I'm sure that there's a doc or some reference somewhere, and they're using pretty standard ranges, etc. And so I can ping Teresa, or if you want to drop a note in the Holodeck, I'm sure that somebody can point you to all the entries in there. And then the nice thing about that, because I've used this for a number of different purposes. Last year, when we were talking about some of our vSphere Plus offering, I actually used this to deploy the Cloud Gateway and set up VCF Plus. And so I was able to go in and expand it, right? So it's very flexible because it's got all that foundational infrastructure for you. So it's really up to you or customers of like, what do they want to do with it, right? If they want to add an additional appliance, like say Skyline, for example, right? They can add an entry in there, and now they can actually incorporate that into the build infrastructure. And again, one thing to mention is that, typically we see this, really being used for like a POC purposes. So not something that's long running, because I know that has been something that has been asked about, especially if you're aware of the 5.11 release, where we've now made VCF have basically what's called, the feature is called license layer, but it's really the ability to basically lean into the license, the evaluation mode, right? Because all of our underlying products have had the 60-day built-in evaluation. But when VCF was initially constructed, there was sort of like a hard check for an ESXi license. And so in 5.11, when you go deploy, you don't need to provide licenses up front. And that's really useful, as you can imagine, right? Especially for POC purposes. And so you can spin this up, use it for 60 days, and then you'll respin it. So the expectation from the Holodeck team is that this is not a long running piece of infrastructure. While we do have some customers that do want to run it for longer purpose, like I mentioned in the use case of using testing. So now they're using Holodeck as part of their development and rollout purposes so that they can actually educate their internal team, which is a fantastic use case. And if you want to use it beyond the 60 days, perfectly fine, but you're gonna have to license it, right? And then from that standpoint, it's as if you're licensing physical assets. And I'm sure the question will come up is like, hey, how do we figure out nested and right? We don't really support nested ESXi officially, so there aren't any licensing mechanisms there. So we treat a nested ESXi VM no different than a physical host, right? So if you're a customer or you want to run it or have it run longer, they're gonna have to license it. Now for internal folks, at some point in day 2, there will be an ability to request internal licenses. So for internal uses, you guys are all good, and at some point there'll be a communication that says, here's how you request licenses. No different than what we had at VMware. For customers, it's going to be a little bit tricky because they're going to actually have to have those licenses up front, or maybe a partner may have those licenses. But if you wanted to have it running longer than the 60-day eval, that's just something to consider. But again, the primary use case for Holodeck is short running, not long running use case.
Yeah, I was gonna say that should be a caveat. You can use either of these options temporarily. They're not meant to go production, so make sure your customers aren't doing
That's
that.
right. Yeah, don't use it for production. But we have customers, using it as a way to kind of vet, their operational, get a feel for patching, right? And that's really the benefit of a lot of these home labs, right? I don't look at home labs as just something that you do purely at home. There's a lot of benefit to how you might roll this out to production architecturally, systematically through the APIs. And so it's a fantastic tool to help build that confidence so that if you're going to go from an upgrade, if you never did an upgrade before, don't do that on physical hardware, don't do that in production, right? Do it in something like a holodeck as an example. It gives you that experience, you can try things out. And this is really where, these types of tools are extremely helpful, whether it's for our internal teams, as well as even for some of our customers and operators.
I've got several questions, William, already. He's like,
yeah,
what kind of hardware do I need to get? Right. Right here off the bat, I mean, it tells you, best 4 or more pods. You're going to have a beefy box, right? Just it's what it is, right? You think of everything that's going to run NSX, it's going to run vCenter, it's going to run these nested hosts.
We're deploying VCF. We're deploying VCF as if this is production, right? In fact, this is deployed as production as the product was designed for, right? And so we want to make sure that if you want all the bells and whistles, right? And I wouldn't say necessarily this is like a trade-off per se, because again, the primary use case is to be able to quickly help a customer, see the value of VCF full stack, and you can go, as high as you would like in terms of the components you're deploying, from just minimal management domain all the way to multi-workload domains with all the ARIA componentries. And so, it requires those resources because these are roughly the same amount of resources you need in the physical world, right? Now, if that's something that's not easily palatable, or maybe it's not the use case that you're looking for, there are other ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that, since I know we spent a little bit of time on just the holodeck piece of it. So that, to me, this is sort of the most comprehensive solution. Fairly low bar, in my opinion. And that was something that was really surprised, right? Like I said, you just need a physical host, single physical host. If you've got an existing vSphere environment, then this doesn't really work well, because Holodeck expects, full control of that physical host, right? And it's going to go and deploy all this infrastructure components. There's no networking requirements, right? So that's really fantastic. I'm not a networking person by any means. And so the fact that they built this virtual pod router, it's got all the networking capabilities, so you can actually exercise all the different advanced network NSX capability is really fantastic, right? So that's to one end of the spectrum, fully isolated, fully comprehensive. Now, if you just want to kind of get your hands dirty, maybe you've got some hardware lying around, maybe you've got multiple hosts, maybe you've got an existing vSphere environment, I also have this automated PowerCLI script. And again, it uses nested ESXi as a construct. And from a requirement standpoint, right, it just requires a vSphere layer, or specifically vCenter running. So I don't care how many hosts you've got underneath it. Obviously, you need to meet a minimum bar, and it's around the 200 gig of memory. It just depends on how much you want to deploy. Again, it's allowing you to deploy a management domain as a minimum starting point. And then if you want to expand on that, I also have some automation that will stand up a workload domain for you. And because I'm doing everything in nested, I'm able to kind of take the input parameters from your networking environment, right? So rather than having this fixed environment, you might already have networking in your environment, whether like a 192 environment, 172, just whatever environment it is. I take input from you as an end user, right? And all you need to provide are 2 pieces of download. One is the Cloud Builder appliance. So whatever version of VCF, go in and grab that version of Cloud Builder. And then the respective nested ESXi version, right? So if you look at 5.1, we require ESXi 80U2. So you can just go download, 80U2B, you go download that nested ESXi appliance. You download this PowerCLI script. You can run this PowerCLI script on any environment. So Mac, Linux, Windows, doesn't really matter. You populate it with your networking, right? So at this point, I require you to have something, right? So you got to have networking, you got to have DNS in your infrastructure, right? So unlike Holodeck, which gives you all of that, most customers will have some existing vSphere environment that they just want to deploy on top. So think of this as just another workload that goes into your environment, right? So you're going to have to set up things like DNS, have enough storage, have enough networking, and memory resources. But I only need 2 components: the Cloud Builder appliance and the nested ESXi appliance. And if you go through this PowerCLI script, what it's going to do is it's going to deploy those nested ESXi VM, just like if you were to do that in the physical world, deploying 4 hosts for your management domain. And then what it's going to do is it's going to use all this information, all the credentials that you want to use, and it basically constructs a JSON file. And this is the same workflow if you were to go into Cloud Builder. So one difference here is that obviously there's a lot of automation that's wrapped in Holodeck. But even in this scenario, you can actually control where the script starts and stops. So if you wanted to go through like a cloud builder experience, you can just use this script and just stand up those nested ESXi VMs and then have it deploy cloud builder for you. And then instead of having the script deploy the full management domain, you can just say, nope, I don't want the script to go further. I want to go and experience that myself. Then you open a browser, it's a cloud builder, and then you can actually go interact with the infrastructure, manually go through the UI, or you can have it generate the JSON file, but just not execute it for you. So the script has a little bit more control depending on the use case that you want to go after, right? So if you wanted to just experience, VCF management domain standup, you can just leverage a script to deploy the ESXi host, the nested ESXi host, cloud builder appliance, and then you can go through a manual deployment. If you don't care for a manual deployment, let the script generate the JSON file for you. So at the end of the script, it will produce the JSON file that uses all of your input and stands up a basic management domain for you. And then if you put additional variables in there, it will actually deploy the ESX host, nested ESXi VMs, also for the workload domain, and it will actually generate you a JSON file for standing up the workload domain. And I do have a complementary script that's also in that same repo that will then go up, stand up the workload domain. So you can see from an outcome standpoint, very similar to Holodeck, right? Setting up the management domain, standing up a workload domain, leveraging nested ESXi. Obviously, it stops at that level. I have other automation scripts that allow you to deploy, the full ARIA stack using ARIA automation, lifecycle automation. And so you can actually look at that script, download those components, and then it can then consume this infrastructure and kind of deploy on top of that, right? So there's a lot of solutions out there that allows you to do all these different things. And again, the benefit of this script is like, again, it's repeatability. You've already got an existing vSphere environment, right? You don't have bare metal to start with. And so this becomes useful if you've got a lab environment already running, and you just run through the script. And it sounds like Joey's leveraged a script. And I know that I've created variations of these scripts, right? To stand up various parts of the infrastructure, whether it's basic vSphere with vSAN, with NSX, with Tanzu, with ARIA. And again, it's the goal of making it simple for you to quickly stand up this infrastructure and go play with it, right? And if something breaks, guess what? These are just VMs. You go delete it and you rebuild it. No different from Holodeck. You can also do the same thing with Holodeck. With Holodeck, you power off all the VMs on the physical host and you redeploy. Now, obviously, there it's going to take a little bit more time because it's deploying the full stack for you. Here, you can actually control at what level of granularity you want the solution to deploy at, right? So this is for users who've got an existing vSphere environment. vCenter is sort of the interface to that. You just download the PowerCLI script, Cloud Builder, and the nested ESXi appliance, and you're off to the races, right? And this is something that I know a lot of users are using. In fact, I even spoke with engineering teams that have been leveraging this, sharing this out, and they can kind of tweak these configuration files and have multiple people consume a single vCenter environment, and they all have kind of their own little environment that they can interact with. It's available on the networking, so there's no special isolation. And so if you need this to talk to some infrastructure that you have, for engineering, we might be talking to some of the build infrastructure that we have. It's all there. There's no special networking, NATing that you need to do. So there's some benefits there if you're looking for a relatively easy way to deploy the full stack. Obviously, it's not as comprehensive as Holodeck, but it does give you a lot of good starting point, especially if you're just trying to get your toes wet with VCF, or you want to go through like a patch upgrade, host commission, host expansion, or even play with some of the ARIA components. So I'll pause there for a second and see if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm showing on the screen here is this is my home lab, right? I actually went back and forth with William on like, what should I do? What should I get? Whatever. I will tell you off the bat, do not get, I thought a faster CPU would be good, but really I should have got a maybe slower CPU with more cores. As you know, any other thing, I need more memory. I had to shut down at least one VM just because my host was bleeding. It was I'm colorblind, but I could tell red at this instance. But as you can see, yeah, I actually changed it. That's your script for right here. I added 2 more management hosts.
Yep.
And I did that just so that I could walk through the process of how to add more hosts to the management cluster or your workload cluster. So,
right.
And again, as you can see, his script just creates a the nested lab for you, and it creates a VApp in the sense so you can just power and shut down. So it was very easy because I just edited what I need to in your script, told it to kick off, hit yes, went to go hang out with my kids for a couple hours because again, I messed up. I should have bought, more cores or whatever. It took maybe 2 hours, 3 hours, I think, to deploy all of this for me. Um, that's deploying the ESX host. Those took very little time because your nested OVA is already there. And then, as you said, it kicks off the cloud builder, right? This part is what took so long. And again, that's expected, right? So it was very simple for me. I actually saved that script. If I need to blow it away, I can just easily power it off, delete, kick it off again. That's why
Yeah,
I
and the
like.
nice thing about it is you can source control that. You can have multiple versions of VCF version, and really the full takeaway, if you didn't gain from this session, is really that there's a lot of automation out there. Lean into that because that makes it super easy for you to repeatedly deploy this environment. And if something goes wrong, you can just blow it away. Now, obviously, you can't do that in production, but at least from a learning experience and just kind of doing things, you don't have to worry about something breaking. And again, because we are deploying the full stack, yes, it does require some amount of memory resources, and there's lots of options out there for hardware, especially when you look at sort of second gen or third generation CPUs. I know that there's a lot of these sort of tower systems from Dell or HP that are fairly affordable, and you're getting into like the half a terabyte to 3/4 of a terabyte of memory. And so ultimately, more memory. Faster cores can definitely help, especially for some of our NSX components, which is a little bit hungry there. And you'll see, your CPU kick up, or at least you'll definitely hear the fan. But speaking of hardware, and in between, a third option is that maybe you're not interested in running nested because you're not really getting that experience, right? Maybe you want to see how customers go through this, and so another area or another option for you to deploy VCF is just on bare metal. And one of the things that I've been exploring is sort of like, obviously we've got our full VCF stack, lots of value in it, but it does require a lot of resources. And I'm always one to look at, how do we optimize it, for, general home lab purposes, but just quickly getting it stood up. And so last year I spent some time looking at the overall VCF offer and look at ways to basically make it easy and palatable, even for smaller environments. And again, it goes back to the use cases. One of my early use cases last year was just kind of playing with the SCDC Manager APIs. And so I didn't need a full workload domain. And I do a lot of work with Intel NUCs and similar types of system, which are not only small form factor, relatively inexpensive. They can be pricey depending on what you're looking at. But the nice thing about some of these smaller form factor system is that they're starting to become quite powerful. With the latest SODIMM memory, so these are kind of like laptop module memory. So these aren't your typical long rank DDR memory. They can get up to 48 gigabytes for a single DIMM. So some of these newer NUCs or NUC-like models can support up to 96 gigs of memory, right? So if you recall a few years back, 32 was kind of the maximum. Then we kind of got to 64 and kind of tapered off. And around 2022, 2023, this new binary memory came out. There's multiple options. So now you have a 24 gigabyte option and a 48 gigabyte. Most of these systems come with 2 DIMMs. So maximum, you can kind of reach 96 gigs of memory. So these things are quite powerful. They can actually hold up to 3 M.2 NVMe. So you can have one disk allocated for the ESXi installation, and then you have 2 additional NVMe to set up your vSAN environment. So this becomes a really good foundational building block. And so I kind of challenged myself as like, hey, could I deploy, a management domain on a single small form factor system? Obviously, you can do that with a larger host, but the idea was sort of like, how far could you push it? And I was able to get, at least the last time I tested it was like VCF 5.0 onto a single host with about 64 gigs of memory. So imagine if you can actually get to that 96 gigs of memory, you actually have additional capacity to do something more interesting, actually writing a workload. And here, there's a couple of interesting things. Is obviously you're deploying, onto physical hardware. You're installing ESXi just like you would do it. So obviously there's some dependencies there, like having external DNS, all that set up. But there's a number of different articles that I've written to how do you reduce sort of like the memory reservation on NSX, and obviously that reduces the amount of resources you need for that. And there's some tips and tricks that you can kind of mess with Cloud Builder to do that. Also, if you don't need a full edge cluster, or if you want to reduce the number of nodes, say for like Tanzu. So there's all these different optimizations that you could do. Yeah, I see Matt was sharing that he recently did this with 5.1.1. So good to know that that works. And again, using 64 gigs of memory. And it's not to say that you only need 64 gigs of memory, but it goes to show that with just 64 gigs of memory, I can get a fully functional VCF management domain up and running. I can show my customers of, hey, here's some of the operational benefits. Maybe you want to go through an upgrade, so you might deploy 5.0 and then go to 5.1 as an example. If you want to play with the APIs and automation, that's a good way. Now, obviously, if you have more of these hosts, you can actually have redundancy, right? Because I think one of the questions was like, hey, should I have one host, more hosts? It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you've got one host and one smaller host, obviously you're not going to be able to do a lot with it. And so if your use case is like, hey, I just want to play with the APIs, I just want to showcase the management domain, then maybe one host is sufficient, right? I can take that, pack that in my backpack, go to my customer's environment, plug it in, demonstrate that right away. If I want availability, right? If I want to patch that host eventually, you probably want to have at least 2 hosts, right? And then if you want to do more things with it, like workload domains, you can deploy another. And I actually have another article that talks about how do you actually deploy a VCF workload domain also on a single Intel NUC, right? So kind of show you kind of the minimum bar that you can get started with, right? 2 standalone hosts, you can actually have the full stack to a certain degree. Obviously, you're not going to be able to deploy all the other complementary solutions on top, but with a little bit more resources and a few more hosts, you can do a lot more with that. So that's a nice option there for anybody that wants to kind of go through that process and go through that deployment workflow. So I have a number of articles that kind of outlines that. And there's a primary article that basically consolidates all of those tips and tricks so that you can apply that to your deployment and just make it simpler for you to get going. And again, try to run on as little resources as possible. Not saying that you should go and make that the default, but obviously some folks already have some environments and they want to be able to re-leverage it to a certain degree. And so maybe some of the CPUs might not be supported. So there's some tricks in there to allow the solution to continue deployment through that. And so a lot of this is just my exploration of just playing with our products and ultimately making it easier. And I see some folks have shared, they've used like Lenovo M720s, mini forms, MS01s are really nice kits. I really like the Asus PN64E1. That also supports 96 gigs of memory. So some of these ones that I'm referring to, they all support 96 gigs of memory. The nice thing about the Asus over, say, the mini forms is that the TPM chip that you can order, it's a proper TPM chip that ESXi understands, right? So if you want to do full attestation, you want to run things like Windows 11, doing VTPM, all these different things, that's another nice kit. I'm actually doing another review right now on another kit that can also do 96 gigs of memory. And the nice thing about some of the things like the MS01 is that it includes 10 gigabit networking. So the home lab hardware, especially for consumer space, it's starting to, and it has been actually on this growth, like multiple network interfaces. Before we were really stuck with one, and there's even a way to deploy VCF using USB networking. Now, obviously, you have to kind of mess with the installer to get it going, but we are seeing a lot more of this hardware out there that is very, very capable, right? Multi M.2, right? So it supports the best practices of isolating ESXi on a very reliable disk and still giving you sufficient capacity to set up things like vSAN. And then from a networking standpoint, these things have 10 gigabit networking. So you can actually even do things like OSA, ESA, depending on what you're trying to explore. So whether it's VCF or even things like VVF, because I know I'm sure a lot of you on here are also supporting customers across different segments. And so the consumer hardware has gotten more and more powerful. And like I said, I'm reviewing another kit that has multi 10 gigabit that has SFP plus connectivity, right? So lots of options, right? So at the end of the day, when I look at all these different solutions, it's sort of not, what would you recommend or what is the best offering? It really goes back to what use case are you trying to achieve? Is this something that you're trying to learn for yourself? Are you using existing hardware? How quickly do you want to get to the solution? Do you want to show the full stack? What levels of dependencies? And like I said, the VCF experience is a program that's been put together by the VCF division. It leverages Holodeck as a base platform and is the recommended solution for our customers or partners to quickly show the full value of the VCF stack fully end to end. But obviously, as I've talked about, there's different options even outside of Holodeck that you can use, whether it's for your own personal home lab or something that the customers might use. And I know some of our customers have leveraged some of this automation that I built and put that into their development purposes, right? So before they exercise an upgrade, they'll go in and deploy the exact same scenario in their lab environment, go through that workflow, and make sure that they fully understand what does that upgrade look like, or if they want to take a look at what does this feature look like, they typically deploy. And that's ultimately how I used to do it when I was a customer long time ago, was that nothing went into any physical infrastructure. Everything went into nested first. So I can quickly show that value to my organization, exercise the features, play with the APIs, go through all the operational workflows. And once I felt comfortable and had that fully vetted for 6+ months, I would then transition that into production. And the nice thing about that is that while we talk a lot about nested and home labs, everything, any piece of code that you're writing or you're using, that code is not specific to nested, right? And so that's one of the best thing, right? So if I'm writing automation to go through a patch workflow using the SAC Manager API in a nested environment, I can take that same logic and code and apply that to my physical environment. So that's really the benefit there that I see for a lot of our customers, that they tend to connect, oh, I'm just doing home lab. There's no connectivity to me using this in production. And that's totally false, right? Especially from an operational benefits point of view, just understanding how the components come together. If I'm troubleshooting, I rather break it in my lab rather than doing that in my work environment.
Yeah. I jokingly like tweeted back to you when I was trying to set up the workload, the VI workload. It wanted to deploy the 3 NSX managers and everything. My home lab, that box could not handle 4 NSX managers at the end. So I was trying to figure out how to break that myself, and then I just Googled VCF or NSX manager, OneNote or something. Of course, I found your page after that. So default is now always going to be williamlamb.com. But this helped me out just in my home lab, and I thank you for doing all this. It really benefits all of us, not just VMware employees. It benefits our customers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And the fun thing is that a lot of these resources are also referenced internally from our engineering team. And I know I've spoken to a lot of our engineering team. They do understand that, when we built the software, it's really designed for high scale, right? Production grade workloads, high availability, all the bells and whistles, which is what we're known for, right? Writing enterprise solutions. Now, they do understand that we also need to be able to make this easy for our customers, for ourselves, and even for development. And so, I'm happy to share that, the team is well aware that like we're trying to make it easier. And so you'll start to see incremental changes to make it easier to deploy and simpler to deploy. Obviously, nothing I can share right now with the team, but just know that, we are looking at ways to reducing and having sort of like a home lab or a small footprint to stand the solution up there so they can quickly get the benefits and ultimately accelerate the ability to see the value of the VCF stack. So you'll see more of that as the releases come about even this year. So that's something I'm definitely happy about. So again, if you have feedback of things that just aren't as optimal, feel free to reach out to me, and happy to connect that with the team. I did see a question around like hardware. Again, there's just so many different options. It's hard for me to kind of say like, hey, go and get this piece of hardware. I know you're on my homepage. If you click on the home lab, I have a ton of reviews of a ton of different platforms. I typically like to focus on smaller form factors, but there are a lot of other systems, the mid-range like Supermicro. Personally, myself, I still use my trusty Supermicro E208D system. It's pretty old. In fact, I recently did an upgrade, and like my CPUs are no longer supported now. Luckily, there's an override flag, and I've also documented that allows me to upgrade my lab. So at some point, I think I need to upgrade. But you can see here, there's a lot of different options, right? And these are just some of the more common ones. I typically try to look at kits that are readily available. There's a lot of new kits that are available, coming from Asia. Now, there's been mixed feedback around quality, build, and sometimes just shipping time. I know the MS01, a lot of folks really like that kit after I did the review, but it's like taking months for them to ship, and I think they're finally shipping them out. Lenovo has some really fantastic kits like the P3 Ultras. This one actually can support 128 gigs of memory. And you can actually have an NVIDIA GPU. And so it kind of goes back to that use case, right? If you want to play with private AI, the only way you're going to be able to do that is you're going to have to find physical hardware that can support a GPU. And so you might look at a kit that's a little bit larger. And so some of these other kits like the ThinkStation, P3 Ultras, P3 Tiny, they come with, or you can actually buy an NVIDIA GPU that is then compatible. And then you can kind of do things with private AI if that's kind of your goal, right? To stand up VCF to be able to play with an advanced solution like that. And then there's a lot of Supermicro kits out there that certainly support a lot more memory resource. If you look at some of the more recent Ice Lake systems, they can get to a 0.5 terabyte, right? And then typically I always kind of hear about like, hey, I want the best system, the small, the quiet, and the cheap.
Yeah,
it may not exist. And the reason I bring that up is that some folks, their lab, the cost to build it is like over 100K. I know several folks out there that's their home lab budget. And the way I talk about home labs and the hardware that you might be acquiring or whatever you're thinking about, right? Think about it as an investment in yourself. Right. And with like an investment, you get what you put in. Right. And so if you look for something that's fairly inexpensive, it might work. but it may not have a long longevity, or as the product offer evolves, you may not be able to make that very compatible. And then you end up realizing I have to buy more kits, right? So at the end of the day, do some homework. There's a number of resources I have on there, including a page that links to a lot of folks who've built home labs, the different products that they've used, and they've submitted that back to me as a community. I think it's the third link there, the view the community home labs. And this actually has a much broader set of different kits, from complete DIY all the way to things like home, Intel Nooks, basically pre-built systems. I'm done with the days of like building everything myself, but there's a lot of folks who want to be able to do that. And that's going to give you the broadest flexibility. But as we have an HCL for a reason, right? Our vendors spend countless hours, probably millions of dollars, to go test all these configuration. And so you can certainly get a system that's fairly inexpensive, but you're going to go test the CPU, you're going to test the memory, the IO controllers, the networking drivers, and you might pick a device that could be compatible with this release, and maybe 2 releases down, it's not longer compatible. So take that into consideration, the overall life cycle. How frequently are you going to use your home lab? Is this like an infrequent thing, and you just want to have a minimal footprint, or is it something that you're going to use for your day-to-day job, especially from a career standpoint? And so I always go back, when you look at a home lab, don't, cost is always something that we talk about, and it's same for like when we talk about infrastructure, right? Customers like, hey, this is too expensive. Well, like it's really the day two piece of it, right? It's the operational cost. And so think about this truly as an investment, and find ways of offsetting that, right? I know in the past, some folks have been able to use some of the education training that they may not use, and actually repurpose that funding for internal career development. I don't know what the options are from a Broadcom standpoint, but these are things that you can definitely have a discussion with your manager, and just see what things are available. But again, I would just say, think about this as an investment in yourself. And then I think the outcome becomes a lot clearer in terms of what route you're going, right? And if you don't invest in yourself, you're going to see the outcome of that, right? So it's not a sort of like, hey, what would you recommend? Because there's a lot of options out there, so there's really no right or wrong. And even for somebody who uses a lot of these different hardware, I still go back to my trusty kit, because I do need to run so much of our stack. And my kit's not the most powerful, by the way. Like, this is easily a decade old CPU. And it's only got 120 gigs of memory, which in 2024, it's not a lot. And I actually have to do what you have to do too, Joe, is I got to power things down. I got to switch up the memory, because I can't run the full stack as well, right? I've got vCenter, I've got NSX running, but it takes up a lot of time, right? So, and because of this automation, I can quickly stand up a new version, whether it's vSphere.next, VCF.next, do what I need, power it down, or just completely destroy it, right? So my lab is truly ephemeral from that standpoint. If I were to lose it today, and I have lost it in the past because of poor choices on selecting very cheap NVMe drives. So that's a hat tip there for anybody that's looking at just really cheap hardware. It's going to fail, especially for consumer devices, right? It's not going to have that level of enterprise grade. And so a lot of the automation just allows me to rebuild my lab in a consistent fashion. So to me, if I lost it today, it's just go download the scripts, update a couple of variables, and in about an hour or two, I've got the full thing deployed again. So hopefully this was a helpful overview, and then happy to stay on for a few more minutes if there's any other questions or comments that folks might have.
Yeah, if you get any questions, please let me know. I think we've covered almost everything that was asked, or it was related to another question.
William, I know you've done a lot with the VCF stack. Have you thought about doing anything for the TCP stack for the SDE, for the software-defined edge?
Oh, that's a great question. I was wondering what TCP was, but is this like ECS or VECO?
Well, it'd be like the telco cloud platform stuff that.
Okay, got it. Okay, got it. No, I haven't really. Primarily, it's not something I look after. Sort of day to day. I'm part of the VCF division, and I've done some stuff with the VECO teams on the ECS, some of the edge stuff. There's some really cool stuff happening over there, but I haven't personally touched the telco platform. I know that they've got some automation. Whether that's internal or external, I'm not 100% sure, but a lot of that concept should still apply. But I personally haven't looked at what's included in TCP and what tooling and offering is available there.
Well, the next thing I want to do is the next session, like in 2 weeks, I actually used William's script to deploy this whole environment. And we're going to cover basically from the script on, and then how to manage the SEC manager and stuff like that. And then there'll be another session on how to upgrade. So those will be definitely public facing, so that you can help your customers. If you don't have a home lab, there's some video that you can reference. So cool. No other questions. Give you 3 seconds to unmute real quick. Cool. All right, William, thank you so much. I know you're busy. You're all over TAMs now. Like you said, TAM chat, was it last week or week before? And I
Yep.
think I heard they might want you back on again soon. So
Awesome. Always enjoyed talking to the TAM community. You guys have been fantastic over the years, and just kind of sharing your customer challenges and things that we can help from the division. So please continue reaching out. I know I've definitely pulled in a lot of different places, especially the last few weeks, but always happy to participate wherever I can. And again, thanks for having me. And this is a great topic and personal one that I always enjoy talking about. So thank you.
well, thank you. All right, you guys have a great rest of your day.